Hey, Dion here, and I'm going to do a series of videos like I promised way back when on Spinoza's ethics, and particularly getting at what he means by this word Conatus that I've named my business after. It's been a long time since I mentioned this issue on this channel. I mean, I've actually only done one video, and I promised that I would have subsequent videos, and then I never made any. Just lost steam, life got in the way, and a lot has changed since I made that video. For one thing, I got my PhD. When I filmed that video, I was still in the process of writing my dissertation, which I wrote about surfing. It's called A Philosophy of Surfing. It is not yet published. If anybody watching this is in publishing or has some tips, let me know. So far, the feedback has been that it's too academic for surfing culture and that it's too light and surfing-y for academic culture. So I am trying to fit it in two worlds that don't necessarily go with one another. Although, I've been to academic conferences on surfing. There is an interest out there, but it's been difficult to position the book. I will keep trying, and hopefully maybe when this channel gets big, then a publisher will come my way and want to publish my philosophy of surfing. I'm also really down to make massive changes and edits to it. At any rate, I got the PhD. That's done. Another thing that has really radically changed since I shot that last video is that I've gone on my whole entire fitness health change. And at the time that I shot that video, I would say in Spinozistic terms, I saw less clearly in terms of health and fitness. But since I am the kind of person who is willing to change my mind when I am confronted with new truths to me, they might have always existed as truths in the world, but I might not have been in a position to see them for various reasons that we can explore and get into. But I had some blind spots. And so here I am. I'm actually 15 pounds lighter than I was when I shot that last video. And actually, I feel that I surf a lot better too. So those are the big life changes that have happened since I shot the last Spinoza video. Let's get into this Spinoza video now, okay? And yeah, thanks for whoever's here watching this nerdy Spinoza stuff. I really appreciate you, and the whole reason why I am even got back into doing these videos is because one of you wonderful people commented like, hey, is there a part 2? And just didn't even realize there was a demand for it. So thank you so much for commenting. I really appreciate that. Keep it up. If there's anything else you want me to cover, just write down there. And yeah, let's get into it. Spinoza's Ethics, as I said in the previous video, is ordered in 5 books. Book 1 is called De Deo, or Of God. Now, this really trips people up. They think, this is a work of philosophy. Why am I reading about God? And it is the wrong thing to do and the wrong conclusion to come to, that Spinoza is trying to convert you into any kind of religion. But it is important that he starts with God. And I'm going to explain why. There are 2 main reasons why Spinoza is going to start with God. Or we could say 3, but I would fold 2 of them together. So 1 is religious and 2 is scientific philosophical. So I'm going to merge science and philosophy together with one another right now. Because science and philosophy and religion all share one thing in common. and that is they are concerned with causality, which is basically the answer to the question of how did everything get here? The biggest of all the big questions. How did everything get here? And then, now that it's here, how does cause and effect work? How do we know that this became a this based upon XYZ processes? And this is very important for establishing truth claims. So how can we ever be certain that anything is real or true if we don't agree upon terms and we don't agree upon how things came to be the way that they are, and how even language developed so that we came to call things that they are? Using the term God for the biggest of all thoughts that could possibly be thought is a linguistic convention that Spinoza is using to his advantage. So I said there's the religious reason and the scientific philosophical reason why he starts with God and why the first book is called Of God. There are multiple sides to the positions he's taking vis-a-vis philosophy and religion. With religion, because people are very, very emotionally attached to the way that they believe in God and to asserting the existence of something called God, Spinoza is doing a move where he's actually trying to protect himself a little from religious zealots who might actually persecute him. He has some experience being persecuted for his views, and he was excommunicated from the Jewish synagogue and the Jewish community in which he grew up. And later he was also at least banned, kind of excommunicated from the Catholic Church as well. So that's just a really interesting thing, right? Somebody who begins their treatise with a chapter on God is excommunicated from two major world religions, or at least two major sects of two major world religions. And so while he is trying to show that there is a Spinoza. Okay, this is very confusing. Nobody has agreed upon whether Spinoza believes in God or not, or whether what Spinoza considers to be God actually ends up looking like God, or the way that other people consider God at the end of the day. But he does begin with God because we need to know about causality. And he does want to at least throw a bone to religious people and be like, hey, look, I'm starting with God. Like, I care about God too. And those are the two main like philosophical reasons and ethical reasons why he begins with God at the beginning of his ethics. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things about the way the text is written. Okay? So I'm going to make a little cut now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit. The entire book of the Ethics is written in geometrical order. That's actually the subtitle of the entire text is written in geometrical order. Because Spinoza believes that we can reach a state of knowledge where we can show the way that things connect to one another in a way that can be demonstrated just like a geometrical proof. So that we can actually be relatively certain about our truth claims by using logical reasoning. And for this reason, he is actually called one of the great rationalist thinkers. Now, there are many reasons to believe why that might not be the case, or whether we can challenge contemporary views on what constitutes reason and whether Spinoza is actually a rationalist or not. There are many ongoing philosophical debates about these kind of things. If anybody has any background in philosophy, you know that pretty much almost anything can be challenged and somebody has a differing view on everything, something, any major and minor point. All right, so the way that this text is written is as though it is a geometrical proof. And it begins with definitions. Each chapter, so each book, 5 books, each book begins with a set of definitions. So that sets up the terms. And actually, if we look at the book like one overarching big geometrical proof, you have to remember the terms as you go through. So the definitions that get set down in the beginning are important for reading all the way through. My professors, especially my dissertation advisor, who I first learned about Spinoza from, Chiara Battici, always recommended that you just go ahead and memorize the definitions if you really care about Spinoza scholarship. It's a fun thing to do. If you want to do it, you can memorize them in Latin. They're available online. Maybe I'll provide a link in the description of the Latin text so you could get into it yourself if you just want to look at the Latin. All right, so memorizing definitions, if you want to do that, do that. That sets up the terms, okay? That sets up what Spinoza means by XYZ, so that like anytime that XYZ comes up later on in the text, you can refer back to the first place where it was defined to understand what that means. Now, of course, those definitions exist in a historical context, and in order for us to really understand how he's defining things like cause, substance, and eternity, we need a historical context. Yes, philosophy is hard. Okay, so definitions. After definitions come the axioms. Axioms are the rules, so how things are going to relate to one another based upon rules. Okay, so you have the definition of the terms, then the axioms are like the way that the terms relate to one another. And when one term is placed to get with another term, you get this, and when another term is placed with another term, this can happen, this can't happen. Rules. You want to memorize both the definitions and the axioms. After the definitions of the axioms are a set of propositions. These are claims. And so the proposition will have like a 1 to 2 sentence claim, and then it will have an explanation for that claim. Some of the propositions are longer, some are shorter, some have little subnotes. In certain translations, you will have places within the proposition where it refers back to an axiom or it refers back to a definition. So what the propositions do is they start creating an argument for how things hang together overall, right? This is a big philosophical text. Well, it's actually quite thin, but I mean, it is addressing the largest issues in philosophy, which is, what is everything that it got here? How can we be sure about our terms in describing it? And given that these things are the case, how ought we to act? That's why it's called the ethics, ta ethika. Interestingly, ethics is a Greek word, and the text is written in Latin, but like it was a Latinated Greek word. Okay, just a little background. Ethics is not a Latin word. Ethics is a Greek word, and ethics means behavior, how one, and we normally think of ethics as normative, like how one ought to behave. But we can also think of ethics or behaviors just as descriptive. And I think that is pretty useful when we're talking about this text as well, because in terms of understanding how we ought to behave, we also need to understand how we're inclined to behave, or how humans are inclined to behave. And this text addresses that. I like to think that this is like a forerunner for psychoanalytic thinking. Okay, so we have definitions, then axioms, then propositions. 36 propositions. They're in numerical order. And then after all of the propositions, and remember, for the purpose of this video, we're just stopping at book 1. I'm not going into book 2. There might be some moments where I forecast why we would care about book 2, but that's not what this video is about. This video is just about book 1. 36 propositions in book 1, and that is followed by an appendix, which is more of a prose summary of everything that he has done in the first book. And each book has an appendix. An alternative way to read the ethics might be to skip the definitions, axioms, and propositions and just go read the appendix. The appendix is much more readable. It's written in plain language that is nicely translated by a number of translators, and that's another thing that I did mention in my first Spinoza video, but translations, as I'm sure you're aware, are very important. I'm going to have a little note about that before I dig into this book. A note about translations: they matter, especially if you're reading in English and don't read Latin. Or even if you do read in both languages, it's still good to just be aware that there are a variety of definitions and there are a variety of possibilities for translating certain very important words. So the one that I like the best is the Penguin one by Curly, but I don't have that with me here. I'm filming this in France. That copy of the Ethics of mine is so tattered, it's about to disintegrate. So I am using a copy on my iPad, and I'm also in a very strange state with internet here. So I will get to you the translation that the iPad version is using. It's 99 cents. I really recommend having the digital copy of this book. And it's a fine enough translation. And again, like I said, down in the description, I'll provide the link where you can have it in Latin. And that's really nice too, because the way Spinoza wrote the text with the numbered books, definitions, axioms, and propositions, and lemmas in different books, and appendices, it's pretty easy to actually go find, oh, what is the word for that, right? And it's pretty easy to find the place in the text because of the way that the text is numerically ordered and set up that way. So even if you don't read Latin, you can kind of figure out what the Latin word for an important term is, just by having the translation side by side. So that's pretty cool. All right, now we're gonna get into it. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna read to you the first definitions and the first axioms, and then I'm gonna skip to the appendix so that you can just get a taste of the difference in the writing style. Okay, definitions. 1. By that which is self-caused, I mean that of which the essence involves existence, or that of which the nature is only conceivable as existent. Don't come to any conclusions. That is very confusing, and I don't expect you to know what he means by that. We'll get into it. 2, a thing is called finite after its kind, when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. For instance, a body is called finite because we always conceive another greater body. So also a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. Again, also confusing. Just hold on to it. 3, by substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, that of which a conception can be formed independently of any other conception. 4, by attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of a substance. 5, by mode, I mean the modifications of substance, or that which exists in and is conceived through something other than itself. 6, by God, I mean a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting in infinite attributes, of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality. Explanation, I say absolutely infinite, not infinite after its kind, for of a thing infinite only after its kind, infinite attributes may be denied. But that which is absolutely infinite contains in its essence whatever expresses reality and involves no negation. 7. That thing is called free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature, and of which the action is determined by itself alone. On the other hand, that thing is necessary, or rather constrained, which is determined by something external to itself, to a fixed and definite method of existence or action. 8. By eternity, I mean existence itself, insofar as it is conceived necessarily to follow solely from the definition of that which is eternal. Explanation. Existence of this kind is conceived as an eternal truth, like the essence of a thing, and therefore cannot be explained by means of continuance or time, though continuance may be conceived without a beginning or an end. All right, those are the 8 definitions. Now we're going to move on to the axioms. I'm going to just hold it open for whatever the hell that I meant by any of those things. We will have a lot to say about those definitions. Axioms. Axiom 1. Everything which exists either in itself or in something else. 2. That which cannot be conceived through anything else must be conceived through itself. 3. From given definite cause, an effect necessarily follows. And on the other hand, if no definite cause be granted, it is impossible that an effect can follow. 4. The knowledge of an effect depends on and involves the knowledge of a cause. Number 5. Things which have nothing in common cannot be understood. The one by means of the other, the conception of one does not involve the conception of the other. Number 6. A true idea must correspond with its ideate or object. Number 7. If a thing can be conceived as non-existing, its essence does not involve existence. Okay, now we have our definitions and we have our axioms. We have self-caused, essence involves existence. Definition of finitude, when something can be limited. This concept of substance, which has a whole entire philosophical history and also a theological history. So that's pretty important. Like, substance is doing something different here in Spinoza's text than when you think of the water as a kind of a substance. That's not what Spinoza means by substance. He means something different. He means basically the substance, like the thing upon which all being is predicated. So literally the thing on which makes being possible at all. That's what he means by substance. So some kind of eternal something rather than nothing. So we're back to the Parmenidean problem, is can nothing exist? Which we do know has a new scientific answer, which is that potentially nothing exists in terms that if nothing exists, nothing itself is a something, like in the form of antimatter, potentially. Okay. Attributes and modes are going to be the way that that substance, the eternal substance, which happens to be God, lets itself show up in the world, that we could at all comprehend that something like that exists. By attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of a substance. Okay? So we cannot have direct access to God. We cannot have direct access to the eternal substance, but we can perceive things that lead us to posit an eternal substance. And actually, we may not have as direct of access to the attributes as we do to the modes. And the mode is the modifications of substance, or that which exists in and is conceived through something other than itself. So that's pretty much everything. Everything's a mode. We're modes, our cells are modes. Everything's a mode of an attribute of the eternal substance, because by these definitions of finitude and infinitude, which we get in, the next definition is going to be by God of being absolutely infinite. So Spinoza has this concept that whatever the eternal substance God is, has to be absolutely infinite, because if it's not, then it's finite. So this also hinges upon what he's going, the next thing about freedom, right? This is also the only thing that's free, because by definition 7, that thing is called free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature. You don't exist by this necessity of your own nature. Sorry. First of all, your parents made you, so you did not spring into existence without freely. You've sprung into existence contingently or constrainedly in these terms. So pretty much everything is contingent and unfree except the eternal substance in this view. And then eternity is the necessary state of time. If it's the case that all of existence is predicated on the existence of something absolute and infinite and free and self-caused, it can't be limited at all. So it can't be temporally limited, and it created everything, so it is necessarily eternal. Okay? It turns out that this kind of eternalism still holds a lot of water. Not everyone is an eternalist, but there are even physicists who, like Sean Carroll, who are eternalists. So this is still a viable way to view temporality. I actually buy it, and that's why Spinoza is going to come up with the subspecie aeternitatis, little okay, foreshadowing. Okay, and I'm going to get into a little explanation of the axioms now. Just went backwards, forwards. This is just really important to nail these things down. In a way, this is the hardest going part, is to really understand these first definitions and axioms so that they do provide the keys to unlock the rest of the text. They're setting up Spinoza's metaphysics, and that is the foundation in which his philosophy and his ethics are founded. So that's another reason why he's going to start with God, because he's a really good philosopher, and he realizes that, hey, I may as well show you what my metaphysics are, just in case you question them later on. Let's get them out of the way right in the beginning. I do want to say a little thing about what I just said, which is, wouldn't it be nice if everybody did that? Everybody who makes a truth claim. And now let's take this to surfing a little bit. You burned me. You were in the wrong. Stand-up paddles are bad. Girls shouldn't surf. Whatever kind of cockamamie. Let's take some things from this channel. Soft tops have no soul. You're a kook. All of these are value judgments that are based upon usually implicit metaphysical positions, because let's be honest, not a lot of surfers are out there being like, hey, these are my metaphysics. This is how I believe reality is grounded. That is how I could make this truth claim about whether or not you dodged that barrel. So I think it's nice when people are like, well, actually I believe in the Christian God, and that, Jesus Christ was his son and was crucified on the cross, and that's my metaphysics. I am culturally Christian. I don't believe that those things are really possible, but I also really appreciate when somebody is like, all of my truth claims, all of my value claims are based upon these sets of beliefs and principles. I'm just going to put it out on the table for you. I'll put mine out there. I'm a Spinozist, so I'm explaining to you what my metaphysics are. Is it very original that I am not really altering what Spinoza has to say? No. I think he did an awesome job. I can update his system in a few ways that I see fit, but I actually think that in terms of a pretty solid metaphysics that equates to a great workable ethics, I think Spinoza's done a pretty good job. You know, as good of a job as anybody has ever done in the history of humankind. What do I mean that my metaphysics are Spinozist? Well, we're describing that right now, so we're getting into it, and yeah, have a reflection for yourself. Think about. I also did not explain what I mean by metaphysics, so I'm gonna go down that rabbit hole. It's okay if this video is long. I mean, if you're watching this anyway, you like long nerdy shit, so we're getting into it, and you are here. Metaphysics. In Greek, meta physis, after nature or above nature. Basically, metaphysics are the set of beliefs that are grounding of your concept of reality. So again, like I said, Spinoza's just laying out his metaphysics in the first book of God. Let's get to it. Do you believe in a God? Do you don't believe in a God? That is really foundational for your metaphysics and for everything that follows after that. If you don't believe in a God, if you are 100% atheistic, you have just as much work to do as somebody who does believe in a God to prove why God can't and doesn't exist, or why a certain conception of God might not exist, right? If you're metaphysically agnostic, you might want to explain your position in, I believe that we don't have enough evidence to prove that there's a God one way or another, but this is how I make my value judgments. I believe X, Y, Z. So it's basically your metaphysical position is as far back as you can ground any truth claim. Right. It is the set of beliefs that provide your working conception of how reality works. And a lot of people actually haven't thought about what their metaphysics are, really. Most people just go off of, well, that's always been how things are. Isn't that just the way? So that is actually to not have developed a metaphysical position. That is to work on the metaphysical norms of whatever society or culture and language that you grew up in. So that's like a little note on metaphysics. We could call them foundational belief systems. We could call them, you could call it a religious position if you wanted to. Your faith system, like faith systems are metaphysical. You could have a materialist metaphysics, which would mean that the way that you ground reality is only in here and now, really hard physical stuff, ways of being scientific that are completely physicalist or materialist. There's a slight difference between physicalism and materialism, which I actually will not get into, but that is a perfectly viable metaphysical position, is to say that my metaphysics are grounded in contemporary physics. Okay? So have a think. Maybe you already know what your position is. I find it refreshing when people have a position, especially when people are super heated about an ethical view that they're convinced is right, right? So when you're convinced that you're right and that somebody else is wrong, it's best if that ethical view is grounded metaphysically. It has more strength that way. I think that moral value judgments and claims that aren't grounded in metaphysics are pretty weak, although very difficult to argue against, because usually the person making those claims does not have any interest in getting into a metaphysical conversation, which is a bummer. Axioms. Everything which exists either in itself or in something else. Okay? This means that only one, like all of these axioms are just basically all to say, you're not God, nothing is God, everything is God, but only God is God. And only one thing is infinite, and only one thing is free, and it's not you. It's not the trees, it's not the world, it's not any created thing that we can measure. There's only one thing that exists in itself, that is self-caused. And that self-caused thing provides the possibility for the existence of everything else, okay? That which cannot be conceived through anything else must be conceived through itself, all right? So, God. 3, from a given definite cause, an effect necessarily follows. On the other hand, if no definite cause be granted, it is impossible that an effect can follow. Cause and effect in this world are operative. We can know causes and effects. That's cool. So there's stuff we can know. We might not be able to know the exact coordinates of the existence of God, but we can know stuff. We can know about causes and effects. The knowledge of an effect depends on and involves the knowledge of a cause. Great. We go backwards and we go forwards. Deductive and inductive reasoning. Aristotle was on the money back in the day. Things which have nothing in common cannot be understood. The ones by means of the other. The conception of one does not involve the conception of the other. This one is a little more difficult. And Spinoza's notion of what it means to have something in common is not the way we commonly conceive of common notions. And there's this, I have to tell you, in the Spinoza chapter of my dissertation, I just kept getting tripped up about common notions as well. It's going to figure really heavily in his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, and how things hang together and how we know the things that we know. So common notions, let's just say, that's how we start to see how causes and effects hang together. That's the best I have for you right now. A true idea must correspond with its ideate or its object. All right, again, these ones are going to be about how do we get certainty about certain truth claims. And if a thing can be conceived as non-existing, its essence does not involve existence. So this is to say that there is something, right? So back to the Parmenidean problem, we're talking about things that exist. And for the most part, we are going to be talking about modes of the attributes of the eternal substance, because that's the kind of stuff that we can know. And then I'm going to skip all the propositions. Okay, I might go back to a few key ones. They're important, but I'm just going to read a little bit to you from the appendix now so you can get a sense of, wow, how much different is the writing. All right, so skipping to the appendix now. All right, here we go. Appendix. In the foregoing, I have explained the nature and properties of God. I have shown that he necessarily exists, that he is one, that he is and acts solely by the necessity of his own nature, that he is the free cause of all things, and how he is so, that all things are in God, and so depend on him, that without him they could neither exist nor be conceived. Lastly, that all things are predetermined by God, not through his free will or absolute fiat, but from the very nature of God, or infinite power. I have further, where occasion afforded, taken care to remove the prejudices which might impede the comprehension of my demonstrations. Yet there still remain misconceptions, not a few, which might and may prove very grave hindrances to the understanding of the concatenation of things, as I have explained it above. I have therefore thought it worthwhile to bring these misconceptions before the bar of reason. All such opinions spring from the notion commonly entertained that all things in nature act as men themselves act, namely, with an end in view. It is accepted as certain that God himself directs all things to a definite goal, for it is said that God made all things for man, and man that he might worship him. I will therefore consider this opinion, asking first, why it obtains general credence, and why all men are naturally so prone to adopt it. Secondly, I will point out its falsity. And lastly, I will show how it has given rise to the prejudices about good and bad, right and wrong, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness, and the like. However, this is not the place to deduce these misconceptions from the nature of the human mind. It will be sufficient here if I assume as a starting point what ought to be universally admitted, namely, that all men are born ignorant of the causes of things, that all have the desire to seek for what is useful to them, and that they are conscious of such desire. Herefrom it follows first that men think themselves free, inasmuch as they are conscious of their volitions and desires, and never even dream, in their ignorance, of the causes which have disposed them to so wish and desire. Bam! Oh. Secondly, that men do all things for an end, namely, for that which is useful to them and which they seek. Thus it comes to pass that they only look for a knowledge of the final causes of events, and when these are learned, they are content as having no cause for further doubt. If they cannot learn such causes from external sources, they are compelled to turn to considering themselves and reflecting what end would have induced them personally to bring about the given event. And thus they necessarily judge other natures by their own. Further, as they find in themselves and outside themselves many means which assist them not in a little in the search for what is useful. For instance, eyes for seeing, teeth for chewing, herbs and animals for yielding food, the sun for giving light, the sea for breeding fish, and etc. They come to look on the whole of nature as a means for obtaining such conveniences. Now, as they are aware that they found these conveniences and did not make them, they think they have cause for believing that some other being has made them for their use. As they look upon things as means, they cannot believe them to be self-created, but judging from the means which they are accustomed to prepare for themselves, they are bound to believe in some ruler or rulers of the universe, endowed with human freedom, who have arranged and adapted everything for humans to use. It's like wha-bam, bam, 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 pow, pow, pow. Oh my God, it's so good. I'm not even done reading the appendix. All right, let's pause and talk about, first of all, let's talk about maybe some things that I read there were a little confusing, but you do get the sense that this is plain language, right? This is more plain language. This is like, I'm doing all of this to explain to you why you're so fucking dumb. Sorry. All right, I'm going to pause and we're going to get into it. All right, so what is Spinoza saying here? He's really laying his cards out on the table here in the first book. He's showing that what we're inclined to do is use our very human systems of viewing the world based upon our necessities and our desires, and projecting them, use the language of psychoanalysis there, onto our conception of a creator God. So this has vast implications. What is Spinoza saying? He's saying, no, you're not free. You notice that you desire things and that you like have volition, what we call will, but because you desire and have will doesn't mean that you're free. Because you see the orange and want to eat it and notice that it tastes good doesn't mean that like you're this absolute free creature that just eats oranges when you want to eat oranges because they taste good. He's saying that there's only one thing in nature that's absolutely free, and it's not you. And that actually, if you were to look deeply into why you desired that orange or that wave, right? Let's use, this is a surfing channel. So one of the hugest misconceptions in surfing, the way that I see it, is about whether waves are limited resources. Who deserves which wave? How do we know whose turn it is? How do we know who's more entitled to a wave than anybody else is entitled to a wave? How many waves is enough for a given person? Why do we desire to ride waves at all? Why is it good to ride waves at all? These are value judgments that exist within the surfing context, and it's really important to, first of all, think about that all of us having this conversation are human beings, right? So we're operating with these ideas about causes and effects that like we're not actually fully clear on ourselves. Well, maybe some of us are a little more clear than others, like those of us like Spinoza who do philosophy. But what Spinoza is saying is like, hey, like chill for a second and really think about this. Like we can know about causes and effects, and we know that cause and effect, like as a concept, is operative in nature. But it takes a little more time and reflection for us to see the true connection in things and not just knee-jerk project our own proclivities onto the workings of what he is going to call God or nature, right? So he's also saying that, you know, all these world religions, especially the two in the culture that he grew up in, have this idea of a God that cares particularly about human things, that put things here for us, the plants and the animals, for our enjoyment, for our use. But there's nothing that really suggests that it's for us. That's us doing the for us thinking. We are the kinds of creatures, it is true, we are the kinds of creatures that experience joy and sadness. And he's going to really get into that. And that certain things that are in the world in which we exist, that in Spinoza's view, and in a view that I adopt from Spinoza, that are much larger than we are, that were created by not necessarily an anthropomorphic thing that cares specifically about human beings. We came up, as did everything else, out of this eternal, infinite substance that does not, if it has a mind like ours, then it's not God. So we can't transpose our thinking patterns onto this eternal, infinite substance, because if it thinks like us, then it is not an eternal, infinite substance. And that violates actually the laws of both physics and logic. So there are lots of ways to see in the ways in which we act irrationally. And that doesn't mean, irrational does not mean bad. It just means that it is a way of conceiving things that might be muddied and might not be clear, and actually might be a lot more relative in the bad sense of relativity. In the sense of like, no, we could actually get to a clearer, more concise, more communally recognizable notion of truth than something that's like very tainted with our emotions, really. And again, it doesn't mean emotions are bad. It means that they alter the way that we perceive reality. So it's good to be in touch with our emotions so that we can tell when we are desiring for something to be the case because that suits us, or whether we can achieve another kind of way of looking at things that allows us to see that, okay, I see how that being the case in that way would really be to my benefit, but it also might not be the case, and I might just have to own up to it. In which case I would have to change course a little, maybe change my view, and that's okay. I have a few more things to say. A main point Spinoza is making here that I want to draw your attention to is that he says, all such notions spring from the notion commonly entertained that all things in nature act as men themselves act. I kind of just went over that, namely with an end in view. Okay, if being, substance, is eternal, there's no end. Like humans weren't created for salvation or some purpose. And it's so difficult for us to get out of this view. Like, for example, when we're going to get into the theory of the Conatus of this striving to persist in one's own existence, like there's no end. You just strive, and you just strive and strive and strive and strive and strive. And when you're happy and you get a thing that is joyful, like that was a little mini end, but then what happens next? And why keep striving? Like, why care about climate change? Are we going to save the world? But I mean, there are good reasons to care about climate change, but it's also, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, very difficult to not think in terms of like some goal that is going to be ultimately achieved. We can achieve signposts. We can achieve little mini goals and moments of joy in our time here in life, but we are blips existing in eternal time space. So, and we have a proclivity to map our ways of viewing the world onto the way the whole entire world works. And that is just something, you know, you just want to pause and like, just think about it. Just take note of that. The other reason why we want to see the way that this operates, the way that we project our human values on the way that like things much larger than us work, is in Spinoza's view, because it gives rise, as he says here, I'll just quote it again, gives rise to prejudices about good and bad, right and wrong, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness. Okay, so it gives rise to value judgments. And it's not that we don't have value judgments or that there isn't such a thing necessarily. I mean, there are things that we can call good and bad, but the way that that works, the way that a thing achieves its valuation is a little bit more difficult than it might first seem. So that's why we just need to, I'll give a little anecdote about Spinoza, which is that his mantra was caute, C-A-U-T-E, which is caution. And it's a really good mantra. So he knew he had to be careful that the stuff he said pissed. I mean, he's basically telling people that they're stupid. So that makes people mad. And he knows that. And he's not telling people that they're stupid because he hates people. He's being like, hey, like we could all actually be a lot nicer to one another and experience a different kind of freedom, that like your concept of freedom is actually making a lot of people unfree. And you're very unfree in your concept. Like if you look, this notion of freedom that you're operating from is actually very constrained and very determined in ways that are very predictable, right? So he realizes that that ruffles some feathers, and there's this concept that he works with of caution. Like, think before you say. Just think it through. For example, let's use the surfing context again. Somebody burns you, and you're just like, so, oh, the wave. Think about it. Take a step back. Was it a great wave? Did you need to get that worked up? Maybe you did. But the moment of reflection is actually ethical right there, where if you are so sure on your value system that if actually, like, I think if you're really sure in your value system, you just probably might not get that mad about being burned. We'll have to revisit that, but it happens in a moment, and maybe you get mad, but then when you reflect on it, you know, you're like, you know what? That was dangerous. You did a bad thing. Please don't do it again. There are other waves, right? Just opening up, expanding your notion of the things that could possibly go into creating your underlying system of values. And that's, so like, without going into any of the propositions, which now that I have entered into this very long video about book 1 of the ethics, and I didn't even get through the whole appendix, which is a couple pages longer. I'm thinking this is Spinoza's Ethics, part 2, second video I've ever done for YouTube. And I would say it's part 1 of book 1, because I think now we're seeing we can get very into nitty gritty here. And I could go through propositions and we can see how those work. And before we even get into book 2, and we're going to see the way that the work folds back onto itself and then folds forward again. And I think that I've done a pretty good job of explaining, though, why he starts with God, why he starts with this notion of, bring it back to St. Anselm of Canterbury, that which nothing greater can be thought, the infinite eternal substance from which all things come into being. Parmenides, nothing comes from nothing, all something comes from something, and in what we know in contemporary physics, if there's something that we want to call nothing, then nothing might be a something. And here's the big takeaways. Memorize the definitions and the axioms. Propositions are important, and I haven't gotten into those, and we'll do that in the next video. And then it might be a cool strategy to do definitions, axioms, read through the appendix, and then go to the propositions. And that's what I'm proposing that I do as I go through these through this text for you guys. Other big takeaways: metaphysics. Get straight with your metaphysics. If you're confused about metaphysics, guess what? That's a viable metaphysical position. So at least you can say that, right? That's so cool to be like, hey, actually, wait, how do I prove that there is or isn't a God? Do I need there to be a God? These are important questions, and they are important for surfing, because in surfing we make value judgments, because surfing is a thing that humans do. The kind of surfing that we're talking about is a kind of thing that it's human beings with human problems, people coming into the water with all sorts of reflected and unreflected metaphysics and ideas of the way the lineup works and the way that the world works and who should be riding what kind of surfboard and like why you should be surfing at all in the first place. And those are just very important human problems. And we're always gonna also come down to this idea of thinking in terms of ends and goals. And honestly, I'm gonna be like straight up with you, like it's very difficult to get out of the ends and goals, ends and means kind of thinking. I mean, there is a way in which there are moments in your life where when you do, as Spinoza is going to show you, like when you do see connections more clearly, you are able to experience larger quantities of joy more of the time. And even though you don't quite arrive at like a fully joyful state, it is worth striving for increasing your powers of acting in that way to experience more joy. So that's a little bit of a coming attraction. And yeah, thanks for being here. And thanks for caring about Spinoza and the ethics and how and the hell that might relate to surfing. And if you have a question or want me to cover something or reading along the text and want to nerd out on like a specific vocabulary word that he used or want some more historical information, put it down in the comments and let's get into it. I would love nothing more than to do that. And last thought that made me think about this other thing that came up when I was chatting with a friend not that long ago. And we were talking about this identity, this concept of the identity of a surfer. And I really view myself as a philosopher first and a surfer second. Love surfing. I really do. But whether I surf or not, no matter what kind of activities I do, I'm going to be the kind of person that asks philosophical questions. And I'm going to always be the kind of person that cares about metaphysics, that cares about how we ground truth claims and how we ground value judgments. That's just really in terms of ultimate values, that's the most important thing to me. And then surfing is second, which is making, in my value system, going surfing is just super important for my physical and mental health. And I love it. And it brings so much joy to my life. And I would be sad if I could no longer do the kind of surfing that I now do. And that I now do, I think, better than I've ever done in my life, especially since I've gotten into the health and fitness thing. And I would still, though, find a way without it, to do philosophy and to figure out ways of having a more powerful and joyful existence within capitalism, which can kind of make it pretty hard. But yeah, so that's just final closing thought. All right, guys, thanks so much for being here.